I remember the exact moment Megan brought up the reunion. She was brushing her hair in front of the mirror, talking absently about her old classmates, that particular nostalgia in her voice. Her high school memories didn't come up often, and when they did, they'd usually roll off me. But this time, I noticed how she softened, the way her eyes brightened just a bit. When she laughed at some inside joke I'd never heard, I knew it was different. "Maybe it'll be good for you," I said, watching her in the mirror, a casual suggestion I regretted almost immediately. Megan looked at me, a flash of something like surprise crossing her face. We'd both been busy, our routine set in place, comfortable I guess. Maybe too comfortable. "I'd love to see some of them again," she admitted. Her voice had that nervous excitement I hadn't heard in a while. And maybe that's why I encouraged her to go. A night off from our life. Reconnecting with people she hadn't seen in over a decade. It seemed harmless. So she went. The night of the reunion, I was alone with a beer, scrolling through Netflix, texting friends who never texted back quickly enough. I told myself I was happy she was out, that she deserved a night of carefree laughter and old memories. I didn't want her to feel tethered to me, and I knew that as much as I wanted to believe otherwise, something between us had been quietly fading. When she got back, she was different. She was quiet, but in a way that hummed with energy. I could feel it in her barely there smile, in how she seemed distracted. Over the next few days, she would mention names I hadn't heard before or hadn't remembered. One of those names, Paul, came up a lot more often than the others. He'd been her boyfriend back when she would tell me small things about him. How he'd gone through a few divorces, how he'd never had kids, how he'd apparently traveled a lot and just moved back to town. I listened, feeling the faint sting of jealousy, but trying to push it aside. It felt absurd, petty, but the air between us shifted just enough for me to notice. Sometimes I'd catch her smiling at her phone, or taking longer than usual to respond when I asked her a question. One night, I couldn't help it. I asked, "So, what's going on with Paul?" She blinked, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" I shrugged, forcing my tone to be light, but it was more strained than I wanted. "Just you mention him a lot. It's been a while since you've talked about any old friends like this." Megan brushed me off, giving me that practice smile, the one that seemed to smooth over any tension. "It's just old memories, Ethan. Nothing to worry about." I tried to let it go. I wanted to believe her. But in the back of my mind, the seed of doubt was growing roots. I noticed every laugh, every glance at her phone, every excuse to go out for a run or to meet up with some friends. And each time, Paul's name hovered in the silence between us. And so, I told myself that maybe I was just being paranoid. Weeks passed, and I convinced myself it was all in my head. Megan was still here, still making coffee in the mornings, still falling asleep beside me every night. But her restlessness was hard to ignore. Sometimes she'd sit on the edge of the bed, scrolling through her phone, or she'd come home with that same quiet energy, like she was carrying a secret too heavy to share. One evening, I came home from work to find her in the kitchen, dressed a little too nicely for a simple dinner. She looked up, her eyes flickering with a guilt I couldn't quite place, before smiling that same smile that had started to feel more like a shield than a real expression. "Going somewhere?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. She hesitated, tucking her hair behind her ear. "I ran into Paul earlier. He asked if I wanted to grab a coffee. Catch up a little? Just for old time's sake." There was Paul again. I forced a laugh, but it sounded hollow even to me. "Sure, why not?" I replied. "I mean, it's just coffee, right?" She laughed maybe a little too quickly. "Exactly. Just coffee." As she walked out the door, I felt the weight of something that hadn't been there before. I told myself I was overreacting, that I was being paranoid, but an uneasiness settled in my chest, one I couldn't shake even after she left. I went through the motions of making dinner, flipping through channels, waiting for her to come back. Each minute felt like an hour, my mind running through every possibility I tried to push away. When she finally returned, she looked different. A subtle glow, a looseness in her shoulders, a small smile playing at her lips. She was quiet again, like she was somewhere else entirely, replaying a moment I hadn't been a part of. I asked how her coffee with Paul went, trying to sound nonchalant. "Oh, just catching up on old stories," she said, her voice like distant. She kept looking past me, her mind clearly somewhere else. I should have pressed her. I should have told her I was worried, asked her if she still loved me. But the words felt tangled, awkward. So I left them unsaid, burying my doubts and fears under silence. The next morning, Megan was up early, packing a bag for work and humming to herself. There was something painfully familiar about it, a warmth that had become so rare in our house. She kissed me on the cheek, the kind of affectionate gesture that had once been so ordinary, but now felt like a vague memory. I wanted to hold her, to tell her I missed her, but I couldn't bring myself to say it. So I let her go, hoping that if I ignored the signs, they might go away. A few days later, the reunion came up again, and this time she mentioned that a few of them were planning another get-together. Her tone was casual, as if it was just a harmless plan, but when I glanced at her, I caught that look in her eye, the same one she'd had after seeing Paul. "You seem excited," I commented, trying to keep my voice steady. She laughed, looking almost relieved that I'd noticed. "It's nice to have a change, you know? To feel young again." I nodded, pretending to understand, but a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that she was slipping away one memory at a time, and I was powerless to stop it. The next few weeks were a blur. Some days she was warm, smiling, talking about little things that used to be the fabric of our life together, plans for the garden, a new recipe she wanted to try, a movie she thought we'd both like. But other days she was somewhere else, distracted, her eyes flickering toward her phone as if she were waiting for something or someone. I wanted to ask her outright. I wanted to grab her phone and see for myself, to stop the constant guessing that was eating away at me. But every time I tried to bring it up, my voice would falter, and I convinced myself to wait to give her more space. I told myself I was just imagining things, letting jealousy cloud my judgment. Then one night, it was unmistakable. I came home from work later than usual, exhausted and ready to crash on the couch with a cold beer. Megan wasn't home, and there was no note, no text from her. Hours passed, and with every minute that ticked by, my anxiety turned into something dark and heavy. Around I tried calling her, but it went straight to voicemail. By midnight, I was pacing, my mind running wild with every possible scenario. At 12:30, she finally came in, quietly as if she didn't want to wake me. But when she saw me sitting there, wide awake, she froze, her hands still on the doorknob. Her eyes widened, and a hint of panic crossed her face before she forced a smile. "You're up late," she said, her voice too light, too rehearsed. "Yeah, couldn't sleep." I held her gaze, searching her face for something, anything that might give me a real answer. "Where were you?" Her smile wavered. "Just out with some friends?" "Friends?" I echoed, unable to hide the edge in my voice. "Anyone I know?" She hesitated, her face betraying a flicker of frustration. "Ethan, it's late. Do we really have to do this right now?" I wanted to scream, to demand that she tell me the truth. But instead, I just nodded, swallowing down the anger and confusion. "Sure, we'll talk later." She sighed, almost relieved, and brushed past me, heading to the bedroom without another word. I watched her go, feeling the gap between us grow wider with each step. As I sat there, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd already lost her, that whatever we once had was slipping through my fingers. That night, sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her with him, laughing, sharing secrets, holding hands. I imagined the things they must have said, the touches that had once been reserved for me. It felt like drowning, like being trapped in some nightmare where I couldn't wake up or breathe. And in that silence, alone with my thoughts, I knew, deep down, that something had changed irrevocably. The next morning I called in sick, something I rarely did. I felt empty, drained, too tired to go through the motions. I stayed on the couch, mindlessly flipping through channels, barely registering what was on. Megan had left early, barely saying goodbye, as if the tension between us had become too thick to acknowledge. I thought about confronting her, about asking her to sit down and talk things through like we used to, but I couldn't shake the fear that I wouldn't like the answers. Later that day, I tried calling one of our mutual friends, hoping for a bit of reassurance, maybe even some advice. But after a few minutes of awkward small talk, I realized they didn't know anything. Or maybe they did, and were trying to avoid telling me. Either way, it left me feeling more isolated than ever, trapped in my own mind with questions I was too afraid to ask. For the rest of the day, I sat there, replaying every memory I had of Megan, every sign I might have missed, every moment that hinted at the slow unraveling of our marriage. I thought of the promises we'd made, the life we'd built together, and I couldn't understand how it had come to this. After that night, I could feel Megan pulling even further away. There were late evenings at work, nights out with friends, quick excuses, and dismissive explanations that only deepened the pit in my stomach. I kept telling myself that maybe she was just going through something, maybe she needed some freedom to find herself again. But deep down I knew. We both knew. One evening, I made a choice. Instead of confronting her, I decided I'd follow her. I told myself it was just to put my mind at ease, to see if there was some innocent explanation. But I knew that wasn't true. A part of me already knew what I was going to find, and I needed to see it to confirm the thing I'd been denying for so long. That Friday, she mentioned she'd be out with some old high school friends again. I nodded, keeping my face carefully neutral as she gave me the same well-worn excuses. When she left, I waited until I saw her car pull out of the driveway, then grabbed my keys and followed, keeping a safe distance. My heart was pounding the whole time, every turn and stoplight feeling like a countdown to some inevitable, crushing truth. Eventually, she pulled up to a small cafe on the edge of town. I parked across the street, barely breathing as I watched her go inside. A few minutes later, I saw him, Paul. He strolled up to the door, glancing around before he went in, like he was nervous someone might see. They sat by the window, and even from where I was, I could see the ease between them, the way they leaned in close, laughed over their drinks. It was like watching some stranger's life, a romance unfolding that I didn't belong to. I felt like an outsider, intruding on a moment I was never meant to witness. And yet, I couldn't look away. My stomach twisted as I watched her touch his arm, a casual, affectionate gesture I hadn't seen from her in months. They stayed there for over an hour, and with every passing minute, I felt the walls of my world closing in. Eventually they left, and I followed them again, half hoping she'd just go home, half dreading that she wouldn't. But my worst fears were realized when they pulled into the parking lot of a small, dimly lit hotel. I watched them walk in together, disappearing into the building, and I felt my chest tighten, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I sat there, staring at the hotel, numb with a pain so deep I couldn't move. The reality of it settled over me like a weight I couldn't bear, pressing down until I felt like I was suffocating. I wanted to storm in, to demand answers, to confront them and scream and rage until every last bit of this agony was out in the open. But I couldn't. Something held me back, a strange mix of pride and devastation that kept me rooted to the spot. After what felt like hours, I drove home, the road blurring as tears burned in my eyes. I don't remember much of the drive, only the crushing silence that filled the car, the hollow ache in my chest that seemed to swallow everything else. By the time I got back, it was past midnight. I sat alone in the dark, waiting, dreading the sound of her key in the lock, the casual lie she'd throw my way without a second thought. When she finally came in, her smile was gone. She looked worn out, almost sad, and for a fleeting moment, I thought maybe she'd confess, that she'd see the pain etched across my face and tell me the truth. But she just gave me a quick, tired excuse about a late night with friends and went straight to bed, leaving me alone in the empty house we once filled with dreams. I stayed up all night, wrestling with what to do. Part of me wanted to leave to pack my bags and walk out, leave her with the hollow shell of what she'd destroyed. But another part of me, the part that had spent years loving her, building a life with her, couldn't let go. I still wanted to believe that there was something left to save, that we could somehow find our way back to each other. The next morning, Megan was gone before I woke up, leaving a simple note on the counter. Gone for a run. As I stood there, reading those words over and over, I felt an anger rise in me that I hadn't let myself feel before. I couldn't keep pretending, couldn't keep letting her lies fill up the silence in our home. Something had to change. The next few days were a storm I could barely keep myself together through. I went to work like normal, went through the motions, but every moment my mind would drift back to that night at the hotel, to the look in her eyes, the touch on his arm. I was living in a haze, everything blurring into the constant ache that wouldn't let me breathe. When I came home that Friday night, the house was quiet. And when she looked up at me, something in her gaze felt different. She seemed tense, almost as if she'd been waiting for me. And for a moment, I wondered if maybe, just maybe, she was finally ready to come clean. "Hey," she said, her voice softer than usual, like she was testing the waters. "Hey." I didn't move from where I was, just stared at her, feeling a strange sense of distance between us, as if she was already a memory. She put her phone down and looked at me with those tired eyes. "We need to talk," she said. A chill ran down my spine, but I kept my face blank. "All right." She took a deep breath, and for a moment I thought this might be it. That she would tell me everything, that she'd beg for forgiveness, that we'd finally confront the truth that had been hovering between us. But instead she said something that knocked the wind out of me. "I think we should take a break." The words hit me like a punch. A break? I stared at her, not sure if I'd heard her right, as my mind scrambled to make sense of what she was saying. "A break?" I managed to ask, my voice sounding strange, as if it were coming from somewhere outside myself. She nodded, biting her lip. "Yeah, just some time apart. I think it might help us, get some perspective." Perspective. That word lodged in my chest, a cruel reminder of the reality I'd tried so hard to ignore. She wasn't asking for a break to save us. She was asking for a break to be with him, without the guilt, without the sneaking around. I felt the anger I'd been pushing down start to rise. But I forced myself to stay calm, to keep my voice steady. "Is that what you want?" I asked, my eyes locked on hers. She hesitated, looking away for a moment before nodding. "Yes, I think it's for the best. We've both been distant, and maybe we just need a little space to figure things out." I wanted to laugh, to throw something, to scream at her for pretending this was mutual, that we both wanted this. But I held it in, forcing a smile that felt as hollow as I did. "If that's what you want, Megan?" She looked relieved, like she dodged some confrontation she wasn't prepared for. "I'll stay at Clara's for a while," she said quickly, as if the details were already planned out in her mind. "Just for a week or two to start. We'll see where things go from there." I nodded, barely able to process what she was saying, my mind spinning. This wasn't a break. This was the beginning of the end, and we both knew it. She left that evening, taking only a small bag, saying she'd come back for the rest of her things later if we decided this was the right decision. As she walked out the door, I wanted to call after her, to ask her to stay, to beg her to tell me the truth. But something in me held back, a final shred of dignity I refused to let go of. So I let her go, watching as the door closed behind her, the weight of the silence settling over me like a crushing blow. That night, the house felt emptier than it ever had. I wandered from room to room, looking at the remnants of the life we'd built, the photos on the walls, the worn furniture we'd picked out together. I went to bed, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her with him, laughing, happy in a way she hadn't been with me in years. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, the hours dragging by, wondering what I was supposed to do now that she was gone. Over the next few days, I tried to keep busy. I threw myself into work, stayed late, avoided coming home until I was so tired I couldn't think. But no matter how hard I tried, the silence followed me, a constant reminder of what I'd lost. One night, after a particularly grueling day, I stopped by a bar on the way home. I sat at the counter, nursing a drink, barely tasting it as the chatter and laughter of strangers filled the air around me. For a moment, it felt good to be lost in the noise, to drown out the thoughts that had been plaguing me. But as I sat there, watching couples laughing, friends sharing stories, the loneliness crept back in. I pulled out my phone, staring at Megan's contact for a long moment before putting it away. I couldn't reach out to her, couldn't be the one to break first. If she was going to walk away, she had to be the one to come back. And so, I waited, clinging to some faint, desperate hope that she'd realize what she was throwing away, that she'd come home. But as the days turned into weeks, that hope began to fade, leaving only the painful, empty reality I'd tried so hard to deny. 2 weeks passed, and each day without Megan felt like another thread snapping loose, unraveling the life I thought we shared. I'd stop checking my phone, stop looking at the door every time I came home, hoping to see her standing there. The hope I'd been clinging to was hollow now, and it hurt too much to hold on. Then one night, she texted me. Just a simple, "Can we talk?" I stared at the screen, feeling a mix of anger, confusion, and some flicker of hope that I couldn't snuff out, no matter how much I wanted to. I agreed to meet her the next day, and we decided on a quiet cafe we'd been to a few times before. Neutral ground. When I walked in, she was already there, nursing a cup of tea and looking at the door. The sight of her hit me hard. She looked different, somehow tired, like the past few weeks had taken their toll. But I couldn't let that fool me. I had to stay guarded, keep myself together. "Hey," she said, her voice soft as I sat down across from her. "Hey," I replied, my tone as neutral as I could manage. There was an awkward silence, both of us staring down at our drinks, neither one sure where to start. Finally, she looked up at me, her eyes filled with something that looked almost like guilt. "I wanted to say I'm sorry," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "For everything. For hurting you. I know this isn't fair, and it's been tearing me up." I kept my face blank, not giving her an inch. "Are you sorry for seeing him, or just sorry you got caught?" She winced, looking away. "It's not that simple, Ethan. I didn't plan for this to happen." I laughed bitterly, to sound harsh even to my own ears. "Isn't that what they all say?" Her eyes flashed with something. Maybe anger, maybe regret. "I know you're hurt. I know I've messed everything up, but it's more complicated than just what happened with Paul." "Then explain it to me," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "Explain why you'd throw away everything we built together, why you'd lie to me, why you thought you could just walk out and leave me with nothing." She looked down, twisting her hands together. "It's not that I don't love you. I do. I felt trapped, like I was losing myself. Seeing Paul brought back memories, feelings I thought I'd buried a long time ago. It was stupid and selfish, and I know I hurt you." I shook my head, anger simmering just below the surface. "So, what? You thought he could give you something I couldn't?" "No," she said quickly, her eyes filling with tears. "It wasn't about him. It was, I don't know. I just needed to feel alive again, to feel like I had some part of me that wasn't fading." "Fading?" The words stung as if it were my fault she felt this way. "What about us? The life we've built, the plans we made, did all that mean nothing?" She wiped at her eyes, struggling to find the words. "It meant everything, Ethan, but somewhere along the way, I lost sight of who I was. And I was too afraid to tell you, to admit that I was unhappy, that I needed something more." A long silence settled between us, heavy with the weight of everything that had gone unsaid. I wanted to reach out, to touch her hand, to feel some connection, anything to bridge the chasm that had grown between us. But I couldn't. I was too raw, too hurt. "So, what now?" I asked finally, my voice barely above a whisper. She hesitated, her gaze dropping to the table. "I don't know. I don't want to lose you, Ethan. But I don't want to come back and pretend nothing happened either. I don't want to keep lying to you or to myself." The words hung in the air, sharp and painful. I could feel the truth in them, the honesty that had been missing for so long. And yet it only made everything harder. "I can't just forget this, Megan," I said, my voice shaking. "I can't pretend that you didn't leave, that you didn't go to him. You broke us, and I don't know how we come back from that." She nodded, biting her lip as a tear slipped down her cheek. "I know. And if you want to end things, I understand. I don't deserve forgiveness." We sat in silence for what felt like hours, both of us trapped in a limbo of our own making. I wanted to tell her to come home, to say that we could fix this, that love was enough. But the wound was too fresh, too deep. Every time I looked at her, all I could see was that night, the image of her with him, and it ripped through me all over again. Finally, I stood up, my heart heavy with the choice I didn't want to make. "I need time," I said, barely able to look at her. "Time to figure out if I can ever trust you again, if I can ever forgive you." She nodded, her face pale, her eyes filled with sorrow. I understand. Take all the time you need. I turned and walked out of the cafe, each step feeling like it was breaking me a little more. Outside, the world went on as if nothing had happened, as if everything was normal. But nothing felt normal anymore. I was alone, adrift, haunted by memories of the life I'd thought we'd share forever. And as I walked down the street, feeling the chill of the evening settle around me, I wondered if that life was already gone, lost somewhere in the lies and the silence that had come to define us. The weeks that followed were some of the longest of my life. Megan stayed at Clara's, and we barely spoke, aside from a few brief texts now and then. I spent most of my days going through the motions, doing my best to focus on work, on anything that might distract me from the hollow ache in my chest. But it was always there, lingering beneath the surface, a constant reminder of everything that had slipped through my fingers. At night, the silence was unbearable. I'd lie awake, staring at the empty side of the bed, wondering if things could ever be the same again. I knew Megan was sorry. I knew she regretted what she'd done. But I also knew that something between us had been broken, maybe beyond repair. One Saturday, I decided I couldn't stay in the house any longer. I needed a change of scenery, some air that didn't feel weighed down with memories of her. I grabbed my keys and drove, letting the road take me where it wanted. I found myself at a park we used to go to when we first started dating, back when everything was easy and simple. Sitting on a bench by the lake, I tried to remember what it felt like to be happy with her, to feel secure and certain in our love. But every memory was tainted now, overshadowed by the hurt, the betrayal. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of it settle over me, and for the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to cry. I let go of everything I'd been holding in, the anger, the confusion, the pain. It felt like I was shedding something, releasing a burden I'd carried for too long. That night, I finally sent Megan a message, "We need to talk." She responded almost immediately, agreeing to meet me the next day. I could sense the nervousness in her text, the tension, and I wondered if she felt as lost as I did. The following afternoon, we met at our house. She looked like she hadn't been sleeping either, her face pale, her eyes tired. We sat in the living room, both of us unsure of where to begin. "I can't keep doing this," I said finally, my voice steady but soft. "I can't keep pretending like everything's fine when it isn't." She nodded, swallowing hard. I know I've hurt you more than I can ever make up for. And if you want to end things, I'll understand. I won't try to stop you." I looked at her, the woman I'd spent years building a life with, and felt the ache of everything we'd lost. Part of me wanted to tell her it was over, that I couldn't forgive her, that the hurt was too much. But another part of me, a part that refused to die, still loved her, still wanted to believe that there was something worth saving. "I don't know if I can forgive you," I said, my voice breaking. "I don't know if we can ever go back to what we had. But I don't want to throw everything away without trying." A glimmer of hope appeared in her eyes, tempered by the understanding that this was going to be hard, harder than either of us could imagine. "I'll do whatever it takes, Ethan," she whispered. "I'll go to therapy, we can go to counseling, anything. I don't want to lose you." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, I allowed myself to believe them. Maybe there was a chance. Maybe we could find a way to rebuild, to make something new out of the ashes. But I knew it wouldn't be easy, and I knew it would take time. Time to heal, to rebuild trust, to learn to love each other again. That night, Megan packed her things and came home. The reunion was quiet, filled with an awkwardness that neither of us could ignore. We'd lost something, and no amount of promises or apologies could bring it back. But we'd both chosen to try to see if there was a way forward. It was fragile, tentative, like we were walking on thin ice, unsure if it would hold. In the weeks that followed, we started therapy. There were days when I felt hopeful, when I believed that we could make it through this. And there were days when the pain felt as fresh as it had that first night, when I doubted every word, every promise, every apology. One night, after a particularly difficult session, we sat in the living room, both of us exhausted. She reached for my hand, and for the first time, I didn't pull away. We sat there in silence, holding on to each other, as if trying to find a way back to what we'd lost. "I love you, Ethan," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I love you. I looked at her, seeing the pain in her eyes, the regret, the shame. I wanted to tell her that I loved her too, that everything would be okay, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I just nodded, squeezing her hand, letting her know that, for now, I was still here. It's been months since that night. We're still together, still working through the mess we made. Some days are better than others, and some days, the hurt feels as raw as it did back then. But we're both trying. We're both choosing each other, even when it's hard, even when it feels like too much. I don't know if we'll make it. I don't know if forgiveness is something that can be earned, or if trust can ever be fully restored. But for now, we're here holding on, hoping that maybe, just maybe, we can find our way back to each other. And maybe after everything, that's enough.